you.
Welcome.
Shall we sit down?
That's it.
Okay, so we heard so much about your product, but I'm here to hear more about the business that's building it. So start by telling me how big it is since it started. What's your setup? Are you remote? Are you hybrid? And how has that changed since the pandemic?
So today we're around 400 and almost 50 employees, I think, worldwide. We're mostly based in Europe, but we have around 120 people in the US as well. And when I think of the scale of the business, I think ultimately what it comes down to for us is how many happy users do we have. And we actually just crossed a milestone of 1 million users from more than 120 different countries, which is pretty cool, right? And so a lot of what we see with that user base is that people love the translation features, and we're kind of a very global company. But outside of that, I think what's most exciting for us is really working with all of you guys here to really find the use cases for AI. There's a lot of hype, there's a lot of interest in AI, lots of cool things happening, which is really awesome. But ultimately, right, it needs to go further than the hype and really come down to something that has impact on people's businesses. And I think we're really happy to be working with all of our customers today.
So much hype. And remote, hybrid, what's the...
So I'd say we are hybrid. We like to kind of build around hubs. So we have London being the biggest one, we have Munich, Amsterdam, Copenhagen, and New York. But I think as a leader, right, it's kind of like balancing talent pool versus some would say productivity. I don't really think that's necessarily 100% true, but you need to be hybrid, I think, right? It's very difficult to do, to be everyone in office.
Well, if you're global, do you think that you could have built, has it impacted company culture, the fact that you're distributed, the fact that you're hybrid? If you'd been starting out in the olden days when, you were all in the office 5 days a week, do you think you'd have got to where you are now quicker?
Well, when we started the company, we were actually fully in person, actually right around the area here. So for the first 3 years, we were 10, 12 people. And I think in those early days, I think it has a lot of value that you're in the same room and you can run creative brainstorm. There's so much of just conversation happening, which is hard to kind of force with Zoom calls, I think. Mm-hmm. So I think when creativity is important, which it is very much in the early days, I do think there's a lot of merit to being together. So I think that was the right choice back then. But of course, COVID also, I think for all of you as well, kind of just brought it into a new chapter of how we work. And I think there's so many positive things around that as well for people with families, people who the remote way of working, I think has so many good things to it as well. So I think the combination for me is great for important creative tasks. You can be in office, and for the more kind of daily execution driven work, I think it's perfectly fine to be working remotely.
And as you say, there's that balance between retention, acquisition, and productivity.
Yeah.
I mean, what would you see your Fortune 500 clients doing?
It feels to me like most companies are ending up on the kind of hybrid motion, right? Where you usually are in a couple of days a week, mm-hmm. because I think everybody values that in-person time, but also recognize that for a lot of people, actually some people are more productive when they're home some parts of the week. So I think that feels like the new normal now, right? I think it's few companies that force everyone to be back in the office all the time, and those who do definitely face, I think, a lot of backlash.
And as you say, it's something that they are continually looking at. It's something that workers have potentially moved their lives over the pandemic. They've had children and they've taken jobs based on it being hybrid or remote, and now it may not be. How are you seeing them communicate these changes?
So I think video, of course, is a big part of it now. The pandemic, of course, put every company into this mode of okay, how do we actually do this? I think for a lot of younger startup companies, it was maybe less of a change because people were already using Slack or Teams and lots of Zoom calls and so on. But I think for a lot of companies also, that wasn't really a part of the fabric of the company, right? And so people had to figure out how do you do meetings remotely. Mm-hmm. Well, probably you need to have they need to be shorter than in person because people's attention just drift after. You can have a 2-hour Zoom meeting. I think that's very difficult. So there's a lot of video calls, of course, but also I think what we've seen is that people begin to really value asynchronous communication a lot more. And video is a great way of doing that, right? That can be a Loom screen recording if it's something very quick, or if it's something that's kind of more substantial to the business. Creating Synthesia videos, for example, has been a really good way for people to kind of not decrease the quality of the communication too much, but without having to be on physical calls all the time.
So have you seen Fortune 500 companies or companies, your clients in general, using these kind of Synthesia style videos to announce, hey, like, back to the office 5 days a week?
I'm sure some people have done that, but I think mostly what people are figuring out now, right, is I really strongly believe that it kind of is a replacement more for like text and slides really than anything else, which people also were sharing beforehand. We see a lot of customers that maybe started out doing a lot of learning and training, and that's a big core part of what they do, but also for things like weekly, monthly leadership updates.
Right.
We do that in Synthesia as well. So when we don't have all hands, then we have a video of me talking about what happened this week. And for those videos, I keep them very short, like 7 or 8 minutes, very kind of punchy and to the point. But it's very clear that making that as video content rather than a written update that takes a long time to read is so much more effective and fun for people, right?
Do you have any advice on, I guess, balancing? I think for CEOs it's quite confusing, like which is the right medium for my communication?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously text and email has a place, right? I think the world would be very inefficient if every time we send a Teams message, we send a video instead. And I think that's something everyone is like figuring out for themselves, like which content does it make sense for, which content does it make less sense for. And I think it's different for every business, really. I don't think there's, like, I for example, think at least where we are with AI videos today, if you're communicating around like a sensitive topic, for example, you maybe don't want an avatar to do it, right? But if it's very kind of instructional content where you're teaching someone how to do something, then it's a really effective way of doing it.
You have access, I guess, to the data on how they are actively communicating. What do you think Fortune 500 companies are doing well? And what are they perhaps not doing well when they're communicating to staff?
I think COVID changed a lot for companies, right? Like people are kind of figuring out how to work in this like new world. I still think that there is among like very senior leadership who have always used text as the predominant way of communicating. Maybe not always like a deep enough understanding of especially how the younger generation really communicates. Where it's more informal, it's faster, it's shorter, it's more concise. It's okay that it's not perfect, right? It's more important just get something out the door, get the message out. It doesn't have to be super polished. And some of that in video I think has to do with if your idea of video is not TikTok, but your idea of video is like corporate videos like they were made 20 years ago, then the kind of way you approach those videos is very different, right? And so I think there's somewhat maybe in some companies at least, not a deep enough understanding of especially how young people communicate, like the way that TikTok kind of shapes how you consume information for good and for bad. I think it's very, very important to understand. And maybe in smaller companies and startups, that is like a bit more implicit.
I mean, I've got so many questions about Gen Z later, but I mean, do you have any advice on, as we said, these are big changes at times. How do you communicate in a way that still motivates your staff?
Don't just use AI videos. I think there's many different ways of this, right? There's one of like, how do you produce the videos? Like AI would be a part of that, but I actually think it's more about the content in itself, right? I guess my style, and I think what I see working a lot is being more informal, being more short and more concise. And I keep coming back to the idea of TikTok, right? There's lots of things that are less good about TikTok. I think there are a lot of people who think that it's a shame that people just want to watch like 1 or 2 minute long videos. And I kind of get that sentiment. But on the other hand, I'm also like, what if young people are just really tired of like information that's, not very dense? And if you're used to consuming information that's like jam-packed with information in 2 minutes, why would you want to watch like a 30-minute YouTube video, for example, right?
Yeah.
So the negative of it is like that our attention span is declining and we just have to get these like dopamine hits all the time. I think if you look at it through a more positive light, maybe it's just that like we're changing the way we consume information and our standards is a lot higher. Like we want the information to be concise and to the point. And I think there's a lot of positive things about that as well.
I mean, as you say, people are in the office more than they were maybe 2-3 years ago. Do you think, therefore, like we're in the office, are we still going to need all this tech? We're not remote anymore.
I think most people still a lot of is remote, right? But I think even if you're in office, I think you'll still have a lot of meetings that probably could have been replaced by using asynchronous communication instead, right? So, I mean, I think fundamentally, like human connection and being in meetings is like that's not going to go anywhere. We just find different ways of doing it, right? And I mean, that's maybe a bit sci-fi-like, but maybe in the future, well, we will definitely in the future have AI clones of ourselves that understand who we are and what we know, and they probably have all of our data and all of our emails. And maybe you can just ask someone's AI clone a question, right? And if it can't answer it sufficiently, you can go to the real person. It kind of sounds pretty weird, but I actually think that this genuinely is going to be a thing in the not so distant future. So communication always evolves, but one thing I think will never change is that we value that human interaction in real life, no matter how good technologies get. I think one of the best cases of this, right, is we don't watch computers play chess against each other, even though that would probably be the best chess you could watch, right? Because that's boring. We want it to be two humans competing against each other. I don't think any of us are going to be watching robot soccer anytime soon. And I think that will always be true for humans, no matter how good technology becomes.
I mean, do you think we could have avatar clones of ourselves sitting in our meetings instead, and we get to do the fun stuff?
I mean, honestly, I think in many ways you probably will have a version of this. It's always hard to prescribe exactly how that's going to work. But I do think that if you look at a lot of people's work life, we all do a lot of busy work, right? Including myself. And if we could kind of get rid of that and focus on the more creative and interesting tasks, I think that'd be a big win for everyone. So maybe when we have AI systems that one thing is that they can look and sound like us, but can also act on behalf of us, then I think we will see a lot of our tasks being automated. So maybe it's in the sense that you ask me to do something very practical. Hey, can you send me an email with that photo that you took yesterday? And instead of me having to go on my computer and find the photo and upload it to you, my AI agent will be like, hey, this request just came in. Here's the picture. Click this button if you're okay sending it, right? And that would be a way of interacting with my agent without me having to sit down and do a lot of menial work, but just much more efficient. And I think we can take all that kind of work out of our daily lives. Then I think that's a net positive for everyone.
What would you say to people who are worried about all this tech taking over the work and the things that make work human? The whole reason we're in the office is for those water cooler moments, and if you could send someone a compliment with an avatar, why am I in?
I think people have always had this fear, and I think we should have that fear. I think it's a good defense system in humans and societies, right? That we think deeply about what this means for our personal and work lives. But I think ultimately, right, the world changes all the time. And jobs appear and jobs disappear, and we work in different ways than we did 10, 15 years ago. And I think the most important thing is just to adapt to the new ways and not be too set in the way that things have always been done, right? There's some people who think that we're going to invent these super intelligent AI systems and there's going to be no jobs left in the world in 5-10 years time. I don't think that's going to happen. And I think even if we did invent something like that, again, that human connection will still be very important. So maybe the onus is going to then be more on our interpersonal skills. You could argue we've been through 20, 30 years now where those skills are very important, but it's been very much about analytical, logical skills. The highest paying jobs are people who work in finance or developers, understand very technical subject matter a lot. But if we actually invent machines that can do that for us, maybe that's not the most important part anymore, right? Maybe the most important part actually becomes back to being interpersonal skills, selling something to someone, understanding how they are, or giving them a great experience, and so on. And that would only be natural, right, that those things kind of fluctuate and change over time. But it's very hard to, I think, describe what, exactly what that's going to look like. But it's definitely going to change, right? There's no technologies generally that kind of stand the test of time. They're all sort of transitory in some ways or another.
It's very true. I mean, speaking of interpersonal skills, so much research says that Gen Z already struggle with communicating in person. I mean, how are leaders going to help them do that and get better at that when there's so much tech taking over the need to talk to others?
I'm going to be provocative and say I don't think that's true. I think there's always, we always have this, the next generation is lazy. The next generation doesn't know how to communicate. The next generation just wants to sit and watch TikTok videos all the time. They don't want to meet each other in person, right? And there's always a kernel of truth in a lot of these things. But I think it's more based on misunderstanding of how you communicate. So maybe a Gen Z is not amazing at communicating with someone who's 30 years their senior, because they come from very different worlds. But I don't think that's necessarily a problem purely for the Gen Zer. And I actually think that when I look in the world and I meet Gen Zers and I see all the cool things people make online, I'm very, very optimistic. I think building building things is easier than ever, making art is easier than ever, communicating your ideas to the world has less and less gatekeepers than there's ever been. And I think that there are certainly bad things as well, but overall, I think that we're moving into an amazing world where it's about who has the best ideas, who can make the best art, who's the best builders, and they'll rise to the top. And I think that's very, very positive compared to 100 years ago, when all those things were definitely not true.
I mean, you touched on it a little bit, but 1 in 5 Gen Zers, as you say, haven't spoken to a single person over 50, which blows my mind. Will this then help people, you think, communicate? Will it close that gap?
I don't know that it will close the gap necessarily. I don't know. I think that's a hard question. Like, in some ways, it's probably like whoever feels like they can't communicate with Gen Zers should probably just invite a Gen Zer for a coffee and be like, hey, how do we communicate best to each other if it's not working? I think all these things will help us consume information faster and better, but I don't think they're a tool to solve the human connection, right? If you can't talk to a Gen Zer about something at work, I don't think technology is magically going to solve that. It may magically solve like getting the actual practical tasks at hand, but if you feel like the communication is not working, I don't necessarily think that this is going to be the thing that kind of solves that.
So what's your advice? Take them out for coffee?
Be a human, you know, talk to them. I think that's the best thing you can do. There are some things in life that AI videos doesn't solve, unfortunately.
I mean, do you have any advice on building company culture when everyone's texting, on emails, on Avatar?
I think you meet people where they are, right? Like, make content that people want to consume. That's again short, concise, to the point. I think it's really is like that simple. And I think if you ask most people how would you prefer to consume information, they'll probably tell you. And I think one thing few people like to do is like reading really, really long documents, right?
So you think CEOs should just directly ask their workforce, like, how do you want to be communicated with? How do you want to be engaged with?
I think that's a starting point. Of course, you don't have to just like ask them and just take their words for granted. I think a lot of the great things about like video and technology is we can also just try things out. So what a lot of our customers I know has been doing is like actually, testing out what works better. And there are some cases where video clearly works way better. There's probably some where it works less good. We're actually working with UCL right now, which is a university here in London, on creating a piece of research around how well people retain information in video versus in writing. I think we're actually just commencing it now. We're of course going to share that with the world. But that's going to be really interesting to see when we really look at the data, how well can people recollect something that they saw on video versus something that they read, right? So yeah, I think you have to figure out what's right for your business and for your use case and who's your audience, right? Someone who's a Gen Zer may also want to communicate differently or consume information differently than someone who's not a millennial, for example.
I mean, you said you were previously based in office, now you're kind of hybrid. How has your culture changed? And is there anything that you've changed which you regret? Or is there anything that you've learned from and pivoted and changed again?
I think when you're hybrid, you have to make sure that the company works not just for those who are in person. It can be easy to forget that the conversations that's happening from across the desks, they're not stored anywhere digitally, right? So you have to be quite intentional about how you kind of do your processes and making sure that information is available to everyone and that there's not a huge gap between what people know when they work remotely and what those people in the office know. And that is definitely hard because you also don't want to tell people they can't talk in person at the office, right?
I mean, do you have any final words of wisdom on, I mean, obviously tech leaders, many of them, they're worried that tech's not there yet in order to be as productive as they can be while working remotely or hybrid. You're obviously one of the fastest growing companies right now. So do you have any final words of wisdom on how to do that while being hybrid?
I think just be intentional about it and figure out your company culture. Everyone is very different. Like we try and run a fairly like low meeting, low process company culture, which comes with the price of some chaos. but ultimately I think pays off in terms of velocity and getting things done. But that changes over time, right? So I really believe that every company is different, and there's a million different ways to build a great company. And I think we found one recipe for doing that, but there are a ton of other recipes that'll work as well.
Embrace the chaos. I love it. We have run a little bit over time. So thank you so
Thank you.
much. And I hope this was inspiring.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening, and looking forward to